the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. It is called Making the Regulatory Process More Fair, Inclusive, and Effective. The Coalition for Sensible Safeguards, or CSS, is an alliance of more than 160 organizations. We represent millions of Americans, and we are joined in the belief that our country's system of regulatory safeguards should benefit all of us. So I am excited to be able to kick off our event by introducing my friend Sam Berger. Sam is Senior Counselor at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, in the Office of Management and Budget. Previously, he served as Director for Strategic Operations and Policy for the White House COVID response team. Prior to joining the Biden administration, he was Vice President for Democracy and Government Reform at the Center for American Progress, where most importantly, he was a core member of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards and an amazing ally in our work. Prior to his time at CAP, Sam was a senior policy advisor at the White House DPC and worked at OMB in a variety of roles in the Obama administration. Sam is incredible to work with. We are so lucky that he is now placed at OIRA and able to give us some insights. So Sam, I want to hand it over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I want to thank the whole coalition for all the amazing work you do to ensure common sense protections that improve the lives of millions of people every year. I also want to thank you for discussing this critical topic. I'm sorry that I'm only going to be able to join for the first half of this, but just it's incredibly important because despite how important this is to so many issues we all care about, there's not enough attention paid to how we might improve the regulatory system through modernization. The Biden administration recognized the importance of modernizing our regulatory system in order to have a government that works better for the American people. When we think about important issues like climate change, equity, economic growth, having a regulatory process that ensures swift and effective federal action is critical. That's why we're putting regulatory modernization at the center of what OIRA does. On day one, the president issued a memorandum directing us to develop concrete proposals to ensure the regulatory review process better promotes public health and safety, economic growth, social welfare, racial justice, environmental stewardship, human dignity, equity, and the interests of future generations. We're hard at work putting together these proposals and are excited to share them with the public once they're ready. At the same time, we're looking to utilize the full range of our authorities and capabilities to identify new approaches to address priorities like improving access to critical public programs and advancing equity. And I want to focus on three specific examples. The first is our effort to reduce burdens for beneficiaries of public programs. The President's Equity Yo calls attention to reducing barriers to accessing public programs and benefits in multiple locations. It also requires OMB to issue a report to identify methods to assess equity. As part of that, OMB issued an equity RFI that received over 250 public comments, identifying both overarching and agency-specific examples of how burdensome forms and form submission processes prevent marginalized or disadvantaged individuals from accessing benefits that they're eligible to receive. One of the key findings was that identifying burdens was essential to understanding whether or not a program or service is administered equitably. Last month, following up on that, we released M2210. A memorandum M2210, which is improving access to public benefit programs through the Paperwork Reduction Act. The memo uses an existing statutory authority, the PRA, and a set of processes to renew attention to paperwork burdens in the public benefit space. There's two parts to it. The first section instructs agencies on how to better qualitatively and quantitatively analyze the burden respondents experience when navigating public benefits applications and eligibility maintenance. It focuses on understanding the beginning to end experience and includes new details related to psychological costs, comprehension, i.e. the learning necessary to understand the forms, and non-federal burdens. The second section discusses how to minimize those burdens, calls on agencies to examine regulatory, sub-regulatory, programmatic, and design reforms that can be used to reduce these kinds of burdens for folks seeking to access these programs. The through line here is that the criticality of public consultation and feedback as a means for ensuring agencies are accountable for understanding the burdens they impose, as well as identifying potential mechanisms for lowering those burdens. Second thing I want to talk about is our work through the Equitable Data Working Group. If we're going to be a significant driver of more equitable outcomes, we need to have the right data to support that policymaking. As part of the President's equity agenda, he created the Equitable Data Working Group and tasked it with identifying areas of improvement in the availability of data for measuring equity in federal programs and policies, and our ability to represent the diversity of the American people and their experiences. And while a lot of attention is paid to OIRA's regulatory review work, and rightfully so, we also are statutorily responsible for establishing government-wide statistical practices. And it's in this role that our chief statistician was designated as co-chair to lead this important working group. The working group outlined for agencies the considerations to keep in mind when developing data collection efforts and identified areas where additional funding would help support those efforts. This includes making disaggregated data the norm while robustly protecting privacy, better leveraging already existing but underused data, building capacity to assess equity, galvanizing diverse partnerships across levels of government and the research community, and developing user-friendly tools that allow civil society organizations and communities to use and visualize the data and chart the government's progress towards equitable outcomes. Finally, as part of our whole of government effort on advancing equity, we've been working closely with our colleagues at OMB to imagine how the day-to-day of government can better address equity. As I said, last August, we put out this study of methods and approaches for assessing whether agency policies and actions create or exacerbate barriers to full and equal participation by all eligible individuals. We've also been working around with agencies around releasing their first ever equity action plans, which were put out publicly a few weeks ago. I want to draw your attention in particular, though, to finding 3 in the study, which notes the need to expand opportunities for meaningful stakeholder engagement. That means identifying and addressing systematic barriers to access and disparities of voice and power. It also means considering targeted outreach to underserved and marginalized community members. Along these lines, we're excited to work with agencies and EOP colleagues to improve the ways in which agencies can engage with impacted communities and to do so early to help inform policy choices. Given the centrality of public engagement to the regulatory process, we take seriously this finding and the importance of ensuring it forms our work as well here at OIRA, including that of agencies when they're developing regulatory actions. So in sum, at OIRA, we're looking to use all the tools in the toolbox to advance these critical initiatives, and we continue to look for these opportunities. In doing so, we welcome input from the public. So I hope this won't be the last time that we talk about the importance of modernizing our regulatory system, and really encourage you all to share your ideas with us going forward. With that, I'll turn it back to Lisa and just end again with saying thanks so much to all of you for the work you do and the attention that you're paying to this critical issue.
Sam, thanks so much. So great to hear your thoughts on this. And as you know, we're all eagerly anticipating what will come out next on this project. So thank you for previewing and chatting with us. So I know, unfortunately, you aren't able to stay with us for questions. So I'm going to move the agenda along. The next section, I'm thrilled to be able to share remarks from Representative Pramila Jayapal. Rep Jayapal is a champion of improving the regulatory process to engage and represent the most people. She's recently demonstrated this by introducing and championing the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which is a bill to improve the regulatory process to the benefit of the public. Rep Jayapal is also the chair of the Progressive Caucus and is serving her 3rd term in Congress representing Washington 7th. She's also a member of the Judiciary Committee, the Ed and Labor Committee, and the Budget Committee. So we will now hear remarks Representative Jayapal prepared for our event. I think we may not have sound, Betsy.
Okay, let me try something. Sorry, everybody. Technical difficulties. Let me see. So I have my volume on. I'll try this again. I'll mute myself and let me know if anything's changed. Let me see. We tried this yesterday and it worked. So, okay, I'm hearing that I may need to, is that better?
In the House of Representatives, where I also serve.
All right, I'll restart. Here we go. And if anybody has questions, feel free to post them in the chat. The panelists will be able to see. If we do have time for Q&A, I'm going to keep that short so we do have time. So here's Rep. Jayapal.
I'm Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and I'm proud to serve Washington's 7th Congressional District in the House of Representatives, where I also serve as the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Many Americans are taught in civics class that Congress passes a law, and that's it. But the truth is that major legislation enacted by Congress that addresses critical issues like climate change, workers' rights, and healthcare must also be enforced by the executive branch in order to become a reality. And throughout that process, corporate lobbyists and special interest groups have an outsized impact, outweighing the common good and further gridlocking our already onerous process. When corporations fund and submit sham studies that undermine necessary regulatory steps, like public comment periods, or when they negotiate weaker regulatory enforcement, these powerful corporations are essentially standing against the best interests of the American people. They make laws and regulations work for them instead of for you, the people. And so even if necessary, popular and progressive policies are passed into law by Congress, these corporations work overtime to make sure they still don't work as intended. That's where my solution to this issue comes in. My Stop Corporate Capture Act will update the process so that we clear the path for agencies to issue strong public interest rules. The act will block out corporate interests, increase transparency, and promote accountability. And it will also create a framework for the consideration of social equity in the regulatory process. As members of Congress, it is our responsibility to restore the public's faith in our government. We have to rein in the massive power of corporations and special interests and be clear that our top priority is the needs of the public. And if we need to lay out a clear path for public participation in the law, one that isn't draped in bureaucratic red tape, making it out of reach for the average person to participate in, well, that's exactly what my bill does. My legislation will vastly improve the rulemaking process by increasing accessibility, transparency, and accountability. So please know that as you all work on this critical issue, I will be doing everything I can to open the doors of Congress to the people while I show corporate lobbyists the exit. Thank you for all you do.
Great. Fantastic to hear from Representative Jayapal, and exciting to hear about the Stop Corporate Capture Act. I know some of our panelists will talk further about that. So with that, I want to turn to the meat of the program, our august panel. So it is made up of a set of folks who are key players in the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. The order will be Rachel Weintraub, Legislative Director and General Counsel for the Consumer Federation of America, which is one of CSS's co-chairs. Then to Robert Weissman, President of Public Citizen, the other co-chair. Then we'll head to Andrew Wedsler, Chief Program Officer of the Natural Resources Defense Council, who sit on the CSS Executive Committee, and then close out with Amy Sinden, Professor of Law, Temple University Beasley School of Law. She is a scholar with the Center for Progressive Reform, which is also on the CSS Executive Committee. So fantastic group, excited to hear their thoughts on regulation, obviously informed by both Sam's remarks and from the representative. So Rachel, I'll head to you first.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. And it was so great to hear Sam's ideas and the work that OIRA was doing. We very much look forward to implementation and looking at the concrete policies that will come about from this modernizing regulatory review. I'm Rachel Weintraub, Legislative Director and General Counsel with Consumer Federation of America. As Lisa said, CFA has the honor to lead CSS as co-chair with Public Citizen. And what I'm going to do this afternoon is briefly talk about what CSS does, sort of the intellectual underpinnings of why we do what we do, and go into that. So first, our mission and our work at CSS is premised on the strong belief that our country's system of regulatory protections is absolutely necessary for the following two big bucket sort of reasons. First, federal regulations addressing food and consumer products, safe air and drinking water, healthy working conditions, equal opportunity, and reliable financial structures, just name a few, protect us all from harm and make our society better, stronger. Failure to provide adequate safeguards diminishes our economic well-being, undermines public health and safety, and allows special interests to escape accountability for their actions. But as we all know, and why we're all here together today and so many days, is because there are many obstacles to implementing effective rules that our work at CSS faces every day. So Sam mentioned, the swift implementation of rulemaking, and we've faced the reality that some processes are deliberately slow and require extensive and redundant analysis. Another big obstacle that we face that Representative Jayapal mentioned, and I'm sure others will as well, is that special interests often don't want to be regulated unless under certain conditions, and oppose regulations that increase what they argue are costs or increase liability for them. And they work to roll back existing public protections, tie the hands of federal agencies, and cut funding for the enforcement of important rules that are already in place. And they do this through opposing robust federal agency budgets and supporting spending cuts, drafting and urging passage of policy riders attached to federal spending bills that delay, block, or repeal public protections, and supporting legislation that would hamstring agencies and make it harder to finalize protective regulations. So we basically do the opposite of all of those things through our work at CSS. We balance the needs of commerce with the need to protect all Americans and secure a healthy and sustainable economy for everyone. So how do we do this? Well, we support proactive efforts to ensure that the regulatory process protects Americans, ensures participation, like the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which others will talk about today. There's legislation that we supported previously. It was introduced in 2 Congresses, Senator Blumenthal's Hide No Harm Act, for example, which was first introduced in 2014 and then in 2015 after the GM ignition switch cover-up, which would make it a crime for a corporate officer to knowingly conceal information about a corporate action or product that poses the danger of death or serious physical injury to consumers or workers. And any officer who would conceal such information would face prison time of up to 5 years. So we push for proactive legislation. We also advocate for important reforms at the administrative level, such as the types of things that Sam talked to us today. We are also committed to keeping harmful policy riders off the federal budget. Lisa is our leading expert and champion of this work that CSS does and leads throughout the broader community. And it's driven by the preponderance of anti-reg riders that would block, repeal, or weaken both existing and forthcoming regulatory protections. And we also oppose legislation that makes the regulatory process harder to navigate. We oppose bills like S-2801, the so-called SMART Act, the Setting Manageable Analysis Requirements in Text Act of 2021, which passed out of HISGAC, the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee this past February. This is just one example of many bills that is not helpful and makes the regulatory process harder. It requires agencies, when publishing a proposed or final major rule, to include a framework for assessing whether the rule achieves its regulatory objective, which on its face sounds totally neutral. But a lot of agencies already do this. It is not an improvement on the regulatory process. It's redundant, and it would be expensive and wasteful for agencies to do. And it would ultimately threaten and prevent agencies from fulfilling their congressional mandates to adopt needed new standards to protect the American people by imposing such burdensome obligations to do retrospective reviews without the necessary resources to do so. Throughout our time at CSS, we've successfully quashed, for the time being, numerous other bills, such as the REINS Act, the Regulation from Executive and Need of Scrutiny Act, which would require all new economically significant regulations. In other words, all the big ticket public protections that provide the most health, safety, environmental, and economic benefits to approved by both chambers of Congress in a certain number of days, 70 days. The rule would not take effect. That would happen and would be tabled until the next congressional session, adding yet another huge obstacle to the implementation and finalization of rules. The Regulatory Accountability Act is another bill that we have opposed year after year, has not reared its head recently, which is a great thing, and that would paralyze the rulemaking process by adding dozens of cumbersome analytical and procedural requirements, allowing more political and judicial interference and rigging the process for special interests opposed to regulations. We've opposed at least 14 bills, and that's an undercount in the last few Congresses. And the good news is that none of them have passed. The bad news is they are going to keep coming up. So we keep organizing collectively to oppose these things. In addition to opposing legislation, we educate our community about challenges in the regulatory process, about the Congressional Review Act. We just had a community-wide meeting about the latest Supreme Court decisions impacting regulations and what that means for future regulations. We educate the Hill, policymakers, staffers, and our colleagues about the importance of an effective regulatory system and how we could do that. And we engage in not only in having meetings such as this, but issuing press releases and fact sheets and reports and talking points, letters and op-eds to communicate the incredible importance of rulemaking to the well-being of the health, safety, and fairness of our country. For Consumer Federation of America, this is the most unifying issue of all the work we do across the broad array of consumer protection issues we work on. Every issue expert, all of our advocacy work, all of our work depends upon having a functioning regulatory system in which effective consumer protections can be finalized, which is why our work with all of you within CSS is so incredibly important. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I want to move over to my colleague, Robert Weissman from Public Citizen, to share his thoughts.
Thanks, Lisa. And thank you for that, Rachel. If you're on this call, you're a regulatory policy wonk. So most of what I'm going to say, you already know. But I want to say this. We have never had an OIRA like this OIRA in the history of the institution. We've never had people who actually believe inside in an administration that actually believes in moving regulatory policy forward rather than using cost benefit analysis as a block towards getting towards preventing the rapid implementation of the kind of rules that Rachel was talking about. That's pretty exciting. And it's kind of amazing that Sam, a former member of this coalition, is now in position as a leader at the agency. But they're not going fast enough. And OIRA is not moving fast enough, and the Biden administration is not moving fast enough on a regulatory policy agenda, and we need to push them. Even though it's our friends, or even especially because it's our friends. And it's not necessarily our friends who are slowing things down, but institutionally, they're not doing what needs to be done. And telling you what you all know, our window for progressive legislating is closing very fast, making it all the more important that we get effective rulemaking out of the administration. And to do that, they need to get these processes in place faster. All right, let me step back. That's the top line, that's the start, and that's the end of my remarks. But just to sort of dive in a little more, as you all know, I mean, you can't really talk about rulemaking administrative law without getting down into the nitty-gritty. But we also have to take into account the big picture. And I'm going to do the big picture part of this and leave the nitty-gritty for everyone else or for your Q's and A's. Q&As. You know, I think as we sort of think about the administrative process, it was quite an innovation. And as it's developed in practice and in law, as a mechanism to enable more public participation and more accountability of agencies that have an inherent danger of being captured, more accountability by those agencies, by industry, more accountability of those agencies to the public. That was the innovation. Unfortunately, that's not how it works now. And the innovative process has become a captured process that works to the opposite of what the innovation was about. It's been captured by corporations who use the rulemaking process to endlessly delay the issuance of rules, to water them down, to prevent agencies from doing what they're required to do by Congress, and then after a rule finally gets out, to challenge effective rules in the courts. So we really need to refashion this system to get back to the purpose and innovative, positive, innovative application that was intended in the first place. By way of example of how messed up things are, and many of you could give a dozen, we filed a petition with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, along with concerned scientists and probably others of you who are on this call, for the OSHA, the Worker Health and Safety Agency, to issue a rule to protect workers from excessive heat. And we actually filed that petition in the first place in 2011, based on data that was available from 1973. We filed in 2011, it was turned down. We filed it again in 2018, nothing happened. Now, in this administration, they're moving forward. So heat is obviously a worsening problem. There are problems with indoor heat, but the biggest issues are with outdoor heat. And as the climate chaos gets worse, the heat problems are going to get worse for workers, severely worse. It overwhelmingly affects workers of color, low-income workers, especially agriculture workers and immigrant workers. There are some fancy solutions when you really get into the details of the rule, but the core part of what's needed to protect workers from excessive heat is water, shade, and rest. Water, shade, and rest, not a high-tech problem. This administration is actually taking the rule seriously, and their ambition is to have another start of the process, is to have a proposed rule done by the end of the first term of this administration and a final rule done by the second, assuming there is a second. And that is a system, and that's why people who are doing it in good faith and trying to use the system as effectively and quickly as they can. That's just the system that is not working. And that's where the agency wants to do the right thing and is not being captured. The system itself is designed to slow them down and interfere with fast action as the law should, and we believe does, require. Okay, so against that backdrop, we really do need to think about what we can do to adjust it. So on the one hand, we're looking at legislative solutions, as Rachel said, and especially as Representative Jayapal mentioned in her remarks, the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which would do a lot of things to improve the regulatory process from start to finish. It would deal with the issue of corporations giving bad faith or junk science to agencies, incorporating bad information into the record that the agencies then have to grapple with, and which becomes the basis for bad faith lawsuits subsequently. It would impose transparency on the overall process, including on the processes of OIRA, to make sure that OIRA is not interfering or slowing down agencies from doing the kind of rulemaking that they should do. It would impose obligations on government agencies to actually adhere to the deadline standards that Congress sets for issuing rules, so that those deadlines matter are enforced rather than ignored and treated as kind of a gentle advice or request. And finally, and crucially, among many other provisions, it would empower citizens to sue private parties for violating rules that are issued by corporations. So when the agencies don't do adequate enforcement, people would have the ability to go out on their own and do the enforcement of the rules that the agencies have issued. If we get this passed, it would be transformative for the rulemaking process. And as Rachel said, CSS is really leaning into this work, but with eyes wide open and without any expectation of immediate success, eventual success, but not immediate success. In the meantime, I think among the many other things we should be looking at, it really is important to return to the executive order that Sam talked about, issued right at the beginning of the administration for modernizing the regulatory process. But that's a short executive order, but it's pretty great. It both deals with some of the things that Sam was talking about thematically about bringing in more voices into the rulemaking process to offset the corporate domination, but also especially talks about what factors the agencies should include in their decision-making so that you don't get locked, overly constrained by a very narrow corporate-oriented cost-benefit analysis, that they take into account what are called non-quantifiable benefits. All of you on this call know what that means. It means basically people's lives, the environment, things that you can't reduce to money terms, quality, dignity, equity, and so on. It talks specifically about other values than economic efficiency, racial justice, environmental stewardship, human dignity, and so on. So these are really powerful concepts if they are in fact infused into the rulemaking process. But we need this agency, OIRA, to come out with a final implementation plan for this, so the agencies then go ahead and do it. It's not going to be simple. Like, it's not going to be that OIRA says here's how to do it and the agencies go ahead and do it. That's just going to be the next step in the process. But we don't get to that next step in a meaningful way until we get this implementation plan out of this agency, and hopefully with the, not just from OIRA, but with the really strong backing of the Biden administration from the top levels. I think they do believe in this in a fundamental way, but it's a matter of priorities. And this one is too easily, it's too easy for this to fall off the radar. And I think in fact it has too easily fallen off the radar. I think it's going to be on us to take that forward and really nudge them and remind them, or not telling them things they don't know. Their agenda and our agenda requires that they get this work done. And I think it's on us to make sure they do that. That's it for me. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Rob. And of course, couldn't agree more with that last point. It is certainly on us in our community. So now I want to move to Andrew Wedsler with NRDC to share his comments.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you, Robert. And before I dive in, let me just say, to double down on what you said at the top, Robert, which is that we need the administration to move faster on the suite of regulations that all of our groups need to press on. More than anything, we are going to have to rely on the power of this administration to put forward progressive regulations to meet our goals. And I think that we are aligned with them on those goals, but we need fast movement if we're going to meet them in a reasonable time. I'm going to, though, as you said, dive a little bit into the nitty gritty. By the way, I'm Andrew Wedsler. I'm the Chief Program Officer of NRDC, which is a global environmental advocacy group. We do a lot of focus on policy. And one of the regulatory policies that I'm going to talk about a little bit is what you signaled, Robert, which is the cost benefit analysis, and more specifically, how we think about future costs and the crippling impact that can have on moving that regulatory agenda forward. As we all know, we're now facing multiple overlapping and deeply serious environmental and public health threats. Many communities have drinking water contaminated by lead and other toxic chemicals. We are facing increased flood, fire, extreme heat as climate change begins to take a toll across the country. There's a worldwide biodiversity crisis with over 1 million species at risk of extinction. And as we all know on this call, our regulatory system can be an indispensable tool, a central tool to solve those problems, but it does need to be modernized. And one of the key areas where it needs to be modernized is that right now we are grossly overemphasizing industry costs and undercounting quantifiable environmental and health benefits that can accrue from those regulations. And the results are rules that are both ineffective and unscientific. And I thought I'd give you 2 quick examples of that. The first is the lead and copper rule under the Safe Drinking Water Act. That is a rule that should control lead, which is a deadly neurotoxin for which there is no safe level in all of our tap water. But the current lead and copper rule, which is administered by the Environmental Protection Agency, is extremely weak, as we've seen in communities across the country, like Flint, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey, and others. Instead of fixing it, I'm going to use the Trump administration here as an example. The Trump administration issued a cost-benefit analysis that used an unjustifiably low estimate of benefits because they were discounted into the future and failed to quantify many of the concrete economic harms, like, for instance, the cost of thousands of cardiovascular deaths attributable to lead and water, which is not only a tragedy for each one of those deaths, but is a concrete harm, and economically measurable harm. Another example is the Trump era rule that weakened state and tribal authority to protect their waters from federally permitted projects like wetland fills or pipelines or dams. And again, that economic analysis of the proposed rule ignored the environmental benefits that would accrue over time for giving states and tribes more authority to review those projects, but focused instead on the immediate economic costs of that review process. And a common thread, as I said at the beginning, running through all this is a Trump era OMB mandate to use a high discount rate for future harm. And what that means in effect, in practice, is that future harms are often discounted to the point of being virtually zero if they occur more than a decade into the future. Like, we can't be that short-sighted in our thinking, in the way that we structure our regulations and assess their benefits and assess their impacts. We all know that environmental and other issues, climate change, air pollution, water pollution, biodiversity loss, these are decades-long fights that we're engaged in. And we need a regulatory system that considers benefits that will accrue over those decades and acknowledges harms that will accrue over the same period. Effectively confronting these problems are going to deliver tremendous benefits in the form of improved lives, improved health, and the non-quantifiable benefits that were mentioned earlier. But we're never going to get to those solutions unless we start using better estimates of the costs of inaction and the benefits of confronting those costs. Modernizing the regulatory systems approach to costs and benefits is a critical issue, I think, for this administration, for putting that executive order into place, for reversing some of that OMB guidance. And it is a fulcrum point that will help give all of our organizations the tools and the administration tools that it needs to confront the environmental and other social challenges that we face right now. So I'm gonna keep these remarks brief so that we can get to question and answers, but that was the issue I wanted to focus on right now. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Andrew. And actually, with that reminder, if folks who are watching have questions, you can put them in the chat. We'll queue them up and ask them after our final panelist. So with that, moving to our final panelist, last but not least at all, Amy Sinden, who is a professor of law at Temple University.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here amongst such a distinguished crew of folks doing such crucial and important work. I'm here on behalf of the Center for Progressive Reform, which I've been part of for quite a few years and on the board of directors for quite a few years. Like Andrew, my focus is environmental, public health and safety law. And, you know, in terms of the regulatory process being important to that area of law, I mean, maybe it's self-evident. You don't have to look any further than the sort of shambles of what's left of the Build Back Better bill to see that, you know, Congress isn't doing it. You know, in this area, though, we are fortunate that Congress has not always been in the dysfunctional state that it is now. Congress did pass a set of pretty good laws to safeguard the environment and public health in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, that said, when it comes to high profile regulations, like the big climate regulations, I don't think we can underestimate the barrier posed by this Supreme Court. But that said, I still think there's an enormous amount of good that can come out of the ordinary garden variety environmental and public health rules aimed at conventional pollutants, some of which will have ancillary effects of helping to stave off climate disruption. And that may, if we're lucky, fly under the Supreme Court's radar. And of course, as Andrew and others talked about, when it comes to environmental regulations in particular, and public health and safety regulations, the regulatory review process has way too often been an impediment to strong safeguards, and cost benefit analysis is really the primary reason for that. So what I want to do is give you a sense of sort of why that is, building on what Andrew said, and what I think we can do to try to reform it. I want to start with just the term cost benefit analysis is a very expansive term. So there are lots of different ways for agencies to consider the costs and benefits of regulation, and they don't all entail the highly problematic exercise of trying to attach a dollar figure to every regulatory benefit. Unfortunately, over the past decades, a very highly formalistic brand of cost benefit analysis that's grounded in welfare economics and requires full monetization and discounting of non-market benefits, as Andrew was talking about, and all sorts of problems, has become sort of de rigueur. So that cost benefit analysis, that term has almost become synonymous with that hyper formal brand of cost benefit analysis, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are actually lots of other ways to consider costs and benefits, ways that actually have proven far more effective at producing on the ground results in terms of protecting public health and the environment. And in my view, the fundamental mistake that we've made in thinking about this is that we start with the theory. We start with the theory, and then we view the real world information gaps that put constraints on our ability to carry out that theory in practice as kind of an afterthought, as an exception to the rule, something that might require minor tweaks to the theory at most. And this has been very tempting for a lot of academics, in my world, because the theory that formal cost benefit analysis is grounded in this welfare economics and economic theory is lovely. It's very elegant, it's beguiling, it's fun for academics to think about. But what I want to propose is that we need to turn around that usual way of thinking about this problem. We need to turn it on its head. And we need to start by thinking about the information gaps that agencies actually face. We need to start with a sober assessment of the information environment the agencies actually find themselves in, and build decision tools that are specifically adapted to that environment. And that will mean, by the way, that we have to give up on this sort of intellectually attractive idea of a one-size-fits-all tool, a formal cost-benefit analysis that can be applied to all regulatory contexts. That, of course, is what formal cost-benefit analysis purports to be. But instead, I would say agencies need different tools for different contexts. So in that vein, in the spirit of turning this problem around, I want to start with an empirical study I did a few years ago of all of the major rulemakings that EPA did during most of the Bush II and Obama presidencies, and the cost benefit analyses associated with those rulemakings. What I found was not elegant and it was not lovely. It was messy, it was crude. I looked at the 45 major rulemakings out of EPA between 2002 and 2015, a 13-year period. In 80% of those cost-benefit analyses, EPA left out of the monetized benefits estimate whole categories of benefits that the agency itself described as either significant, important, or substantial. And those words all have quotes around them. Those are the words the agency was actually using. What about the other 20%? Well, I have to say, I looked at those pretty carefully. And the fact is, there were significant, important, and substantial benefits left out there too of the monetized benefits estimate. The agency just didn't happen to say so in so many words. The bottom line is, EPA almost never has the data it needs to actually conduct a formal cost-benefit analysis. In other words, inadequate data is not the exception, it's the rule. And the inability to quantify the benefits is only part of it. Most of the time, they're also considering 1, 2 alternatives, maybe 3. In 40% of the rulemakings in my study, they literally considered 1 alternative. So what that means is that as practiced, this purportedly highly formalistic cost-benefit analysis is not what it purports to be. It's not a tool for net welfare maximization. It's just not. You can't figure out what's the alternative that maximizes net benefit when you only look at 1 and you haven't monetized all of the benefits. And these yawning data gaps, they're not just a matter of let's do a little more research and spend a little more time and we'll get the data. In most instances, there are deep epistemic barriers to us ever collecting the relevant data. So that's the bad news. The information constraints are real and they're pervasive. So the question then becomes, what do we do about it? The good news is that at least in the environmental health and safety realm, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when Congress was still functioning and passed virtually all the statutes that govern in this area, Congress was very cognizant of the exact information constraints that I'm talking about. That Congress understood that agencies were confronting those constraints and actually went about crafting the decision tools that it directed agencies to use very much in the way I'm suggesting. That is, start with the information constraints and craft decision tools that are designed to work around those constraints. So in the environmental statutes, for example, you see Congress repeatedly moving away from optimizing tools like cost-benefit analysis and health-based standards with their enormous and unrealistic information demands, and adopting instead what we might think of as fast and frugal decision tools in this tradition of Herbert Simon. Tools that exploit the specific characteristics of the information environment that agencies actually face in order to work around informational limits. In environmental law, the most prominent of these are feasibility standards or technology-based standards, which you can think of as a less formal variety of cost-benefit analysis, as a way of considering the costs and the benefits of regulation, but a method that plays to agencies' strengths in terms of the information they have available to them. As I say, the best decision tool, the best way to consider costs and benefits will vary with context. For other areas of law and other agencies, the other tools will make sense. But if OIRA is serious about promoting the progressive vision of regulation that got Biden elected, they will return to the statutes. Rather than trying to shoehorn every agency regulation into this hyper-formalistic cost-benefit framework that's become so fashionable, and bog the agencies down in efforts to monetize the unmonetizable, OIRA will instruct each agency to articulate for them the methods their particular organic statutes instruct them to use for consideration of regulatory costs and benefits, and then let those statutory standards guide their regulatory impact analysis. I'm going to stop there, but thanks so much for having me, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Professor Sinden, for that really cogent critique of cost-benefit analysis. So as a reminder, folks should put questions in the chat who have them. We have a few already. Although we did just hear that assessment of CBA, I think we are going to start with a cost-benefit analysis question directed at Andrew Wedsler. So the question is, what discount rates do you think agencies should use in cost-benefit analysis? Do you support a declining discount rate schedule? Should agencies wait for OMB to update Circular A4, or should they begin on their own to use lower discount rates in their analyses? Well,
that's quite a mouthful. I'll do the best I can. I may not give you as precise answers as you want. And I'll start kind of looking at it backwards by saying, and this, I think this gets to Amy's point of view about the fact that agencies need flexible tools. We need to look at the end result that we want. In other words, do we want an agency to do an analysis of costs and benefits, whether flexible or not, that entirely discounts benefits that occur after a certain time period? Because that's the effect of what we have now. And I think the answer is clearly that we don't, that we need that the discount rate, and there's nothing in theory and wrong with a discount rate. And I do think a declining discount rate is something that makes sense. But where we set that exact rate has to be backwards engineered from the kind of impacts and the kind of benefits that we want to take into account and over that period of time. Being very mechanized and rigid about it so that we're zeroing out effectively benefits that we all know that we need to take into account that are going to accrue after a certain period of time creates intergenerational equity issues that we need to be very cognizant of, and I think is contrary to the longer term view of environmental insults and remedies that we all need to take account of. As for the circular A4 question, I kind of have a mixed view of it. On the one hand, I would prefer agencies not to wait for a update whose time frame is uncertain. If I was an attorney within the agency, I might be a little bit nervous about just discounting a circular. I mean, there's a real litigation risk, I think, for some agencies that need to take into account of. That's a balancing act. I don't really know what the exact answer is, and it's probably a case-by-case response.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew. So just a question about the opportunity moment that we're in. Rob, I heard you speak so clearly to what it means to all of us to have friends inside OIRA and what a difference it can make. Critics often say that OIRA doesn't quite have the authority to do everything that we would like to see them do, and we should instead be waiting for Congress. So would love just anyone to comment on the question of how much can OIRA do now? We're all obviously eagerly awaiting what might come out of this EO.
Well, I'll jump in. So I think OIRA has a ton of authority, and I don't really see how anybody could argue out to the contrary, given what we've seen over the last 50 years. It's one of the most powerful agencies. It's certainly its impact per employee. It's got to rank it very, very high among all governmental agencies, and it hasn't been shy in using its power to block regulatory progress. So there's no reason it doesn't have comparable power to facilitate regulatory process. I think that said, it can't, although it can actually stop agencies from doing things effectively, it can't necessarily make them do things. So the first thing it can do is and I believe, although this is, both for all of us collectively to analyze, I believe it has done the first thing, which is stop being the kind of barrier that the agency has historically been to rulemaking under Democratic and Republican administrations. Beyond that, though, in terms of trying to do the things that are discussed in the Modernizing Regulatory Executive Order, I think they're going to have to do two things. One, it's not because of the stuff that Professor Sinden was talking about. The mindset is so different, and it's pretty baked into the agencies now, that thinking about the kind of vision in the executive order requires help. There's like an intellectual piece of work that the agencies need OIRA to do for them. So that's why it's so important that the implementing documents and guidance get out, I think, from the agency. And then after that, they're going to actually have to work with the agencies, many of whose rulemaking staffs are relatively small given the size of what they have to do. At least the size of what they have to do is defined by the courts. They're going to have to help them do, assuming good faith, which won't always be there, but assuming good faith by the agencies, they're going to have to help the agencies do the work in a different way. And there's absolutely going to be a challenge between the dual imperatives of taking into account things that have not been taken into account adequately and going much, much faster than has historically been done. So I think there's a ton of work for OIRA to do to facilitate this. I think the first thing is stop being a problem. I feel, again, we should survey everybody to get a sense of my sense is that they're doing that pretty well. Maybe not every time, but not compared to all history, pretty good. But actually then moving this thing forward and turning the aspirations and the promise of the executive order into action, I think they're going to be absolutely crucial. I think they've got a ton of possible influence, and they got to start doing it to have any of that influence.
Thanks, Rob.
I would just add that in terms of my recommendation that OIRA urge the agencies to go back to their statutory mandates and use those methods for considering costs and benefits to structure their regulatory impact analyses. I think that can be done well within the existing executive orders on cost benefit analysis within 12866 and the Obama order. In other words, both of those orders have lots of language about the need to consider unquantifiable costs and benefits. They talk about things like dignity. They talk about things like equity, which any economist knows that you actually can't analyze under cost benefit analysis. I mean, unless you try to do these distributional weights, which is sort of a mess to try to actually do in practice. There's a way in which, because cost benefit analysis is literally, like, by definition, an aggregate measure of cost of benefits for society as a whole. Like, it doesn't look at distribution, it just doesn't. And yet the executive orders are telling the agencies to look at distribution. So I guess my overall point is that this kind of flexibility that I'm urging OIRA to give to the agencies is already there within the existing executive orders. And while I'd like to see them issue a new executive order that's really gonna spell out the various elements of this regulatory reform proposal, in the meantime, it seems to me there's an awful lot of flexibility that they can offer to the agencies. And in the same vein, with respect to discount rates, I would say, let's not assume that this sort of hyper quantification and monetization is always the way to go. I mean, when as it so often does, when it turns out that you just can't put a dollar figure on a lot of these things, then it's not clear that we should be thinking about discount rates. Discount rates are highly problematic, even when we can put a dollar figure on things, as Andrew was alluding to. Once you're talking about intergenerational time spans and the enormous time spans that we have to think about in the context of the climate crisis. And of course, the climate crisis pervades everything at this point, right? I mean, so much of even the conventional pollution that we're dealing with, it all comes down to fossil fuel extraction and combustion on some level. It's not at all clear that, the problem with discount rates is that we look to economists to tell us what the discount rate is supposed to be. Well, guess what? Once you're talking about intergenerational equity, as Andrew was saying, economists don't know. They don't know the answer to what's a fair sort of distribution of benefits and burdens across generations. That's a question of values that we all have to answer. And it's like so many of these value judgments that get hidden and embedded within the structure of formal cost benefit analysis. And that's one of the things that makes this monetization enterprise so problematic.
Thanks for that. So I have a question that's a practical one for OIRA experts from someone who works as an advocate for the Department of Energy, talking about how DOE has a lot of legal deadlines to review and upwards of 60 standards to do just this presidential term. So getting them done in a timely way looks to require some kind of streamlined review process within OIRA, particularly because a lot of these regs are very similar. So the question is, how can they do that? How can OIRA, review rules that are very similar and expedite the process so we can actually get things done? So I don't know if anyone has insights into this. I guess I'm partly looking at you, Andrew, as an environmental expert, or you, Professor Sinden, but we may, since we've lost our OIRA rep, we may not know.
Well, I will say, first, I just want to affirm the question. Like and this is just the appliance standards is a small tip of a very large iceberg. But we really cannot underestimate the regulatory challenge that this administration is facing, and the fact that the past practices of both Democratic and Republican administrations won't cut it if we're going to have the kind of regulatory reform that we need to confront the problems that we have. And I do think that our OIRA needs to, which has historically and hopefully will no longer be a real roadblock in the timely issuance of rules, has to look at how it can streamline its regulatory review. And I think that the appliance standards are a great example of where it might be able to be a little creative. The questioner is right that the standards are similar in intent and structure. They often rely on overlapping data. I wouldn't want to, I'm not enough of an expert in OIRA to say whether, what the barriers to be for some sort of batch review, but that's certainly the kind of creative suggestion that I would hope that the administration is looking at.
I really liked the provision of the Stop Corporate Capture Act that puts a 45-day limit on OIRA review and then makes the default, like the rule just goes forward. Like if you guys don't get to it, that doesn't stop, that doesn't stop progress. The rule goes forward without further OIRA review. I love that sort of switching of the default. And I do think the time pressure is just, as Andrew says, enormous right now.
Absolutely. Well, on the Stop Corporate Capture Act, someone else has a question about that, commenting that it sounds like the Stop Corporate Capture Act and the Day One memo would increase opportunities for public participation in the regulatory system. Do conservatives support these measures, given that they are always talking about the need to make agencies more accountable to the public? Great question. Who has thoughts on that one?
I would say we haven't seen support for it yet. And I think James's question gets to, and I think we probably, on the other hand, I think, well, episodically we do around particular things, which, I think speaks to the point that for some of these issues, what you want is depends on, who's in office. But I think one thing that the Stop Corporate Capture Act does that cuts across that and is principled which is to say, you want to block rules you don't like, you want to speed rules you do like, whichever they are. But with the Stop Corporate Capture Act, there's a difference between corporations and human beings in the public. And those are both moral categorically different. And they're also their power differential different, and they're in terms of influence and purpose, influence on the agencies and the purposes of what the agencies are supposed to do, they're different. So the Stop Corporate Capture Act really speaks to the undue influence of corporations. It doesn't favor, the interests of Consumer Federation of America supporters over those of Heritage Foundation supporters. It just favors those interests of people over Exxon or Google.
Thanks, Rob. That's a very valuable point.
And I guess the other thing on the issue of timing, I would just say, again, is that part of where my proposal is coming from of trying to offer the agencies more flexibility is an effort to try to streamline this process, right? Too often the agencies get stymied and delayed by the monetization requirement. One rule I spent a lot of time looking at was the cooling water intake structure rule that, made its way up to the Supreme Court and then was back down and so forth. But, at one iteration of that rule, it's all about dead fish, right? That get sucked into those cooling water intakes. And so it's not that easy to monetize. I mean, you monetize like the salmon, I guess, because we put it on our dinner plate, we pay for it, but the other stuff is like really hard. And so, but EPA felt the need. They had so much pressure from OIRA to put a dollar figure on the dead fish that they did this whole willingness to pay study, right? This is where they go down to a shopping mall and they stand there and they talk to people and they're like, how much would you be willing to pay per year to save, this kind of wild animal from whatever being harmed or going extinct or something. And people say a number, and they do this a whole bunch of times, and they come up with these numbers. And you can imagine they are just fraught with difficulty. And of course, they did this whole study. It took them forever, cost them lots of money. And then, you know, the conservative economists came back and said, oh my gosh, the number is too high for this reason, that reason, and the other reason. And they had all kinds of arguments about how the study was set up wrong and da 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 da. And then the environmentalist economists came in on the other side and showed how the study was actually lowballing the number. And, you know, finally, what did EPA do after all of that time and energy and money? They threw up their hands and they didn't even use it in the cost benefit analysis because it was so controversial. Because the fact is, you can't put a dollar figure on the value of an aquatic ecosystem, right? I mean, we don't even know all of the values that that aquatic ecosystem is serving, let alone being able to measure them. So that, you know, that's just part of this whole thing, is that the formality of the cost benefit analysis requirements has really bollocksed the agencies up in so many instances.
Thanks for that. That's a great, very illustrative example. Rachel?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask Professor Sinden about how we solve that issue. Like I know from my work at CPSC that some of their organic statutes have such rigorous cost benefit analysis that if you go back to the statutes, you know, that's where there are no rules for decades. So how do you deal with that issue? Because there needs to be cost benefit analysis of every alternative, and it's just roadblock after roadblock, sort of, you know, what you described happening again and again for like each different alternative. So how do we move this process forward with getting, you know, final important consumer protective rules when sometimes the organic statutes themselves, you know, are so problematic?
Yeah, no, it's such a good question, Rachel. I wish I had a good answer for you, because, you know, the consumer protection statutes is not really the area I tend to focus on. So in the environmental realm, the reality is that the vast majority of the statutes don't use cost benefit analysis, precisely because Congress sort of recognized this problem. And, you know, in various contexts where they even just required health-based standards at first, which are also quite demanding in terms of information, not quite as demanding as cost benefit analysis, but also demanding. There were all of these instances in the environmental laws where Congress required that initially, and then got really frustrated, right? When the agency came back a decade, 2 decades later, having only regulated, you know, a handful of pollutants of the thousands that are out there. And Congress was like, this isn't going to work. We're going to do this feasibility approach that is actually far more effective and doesn't require this sort of granular examination of benefits data that we don't have. But I would love to actually talk to you more about sort of the consumer protection statutes and ways of trying to construe those, right? I do think my sense is that they're not actually explicitly requiring a formal cost benefit analysis. I know there's been some court opinions that have tried to take it in that direction, but a lot of court opinions that I've looked at have actually pushed away from formality, right? In their interpretations of these statutes. And I will say that even Justice Scalia was one of those who, when he wrote about cost benefit analysis, he would always put a caveat in that we're not expecting the agency to do some formal monetized cost benefit analysis. He was actually quite skeptical of cost benefit analysis. Now, I understand he's not on the court anymore, but, you know, somebody did an article about how Justice Scalia has more influence now than he ever did when he was on the court, because there's so many justices now on the court falling all over themselves to sort of, you know, be the voice of Scalia from the grave. Justice Kavanaugh comes to mind. So, you know, one thing I'd like to write is a sort of, if anyone knows, like, what are the outlets that Justice Kavanaugh reads, is to give him a little primer on how skeptical even Justice Scalia was of interpreting cost benefit requirements as actually requiring this sort of formal monetized analysis. So in other words, you can take the consumer protection statutes and argue that, look, you're supposed to weigh costs and benefits, doesn't necessarily mean you got to get into monetizing every single thing and attaching discount rates and that whole mess.
You know, that's one reason why I think it's so important that we nudge and encourage OIRA to get this guidance out, because I think we do need to facilitate these kinds of conversations. I think there are a lot of creative ideas, but I mean, that's going to be the touchstone for what's going to happen is their document. I'm sorry, I lost track in the chat who made the point about the energy department rules, but but that implicit suggesting of batching, like that's a great idea, right? But there are a lot of things that might be great ideas that we need, and we need them, but we need like a focal point for having the conversation about ways to sort of translate that, the very short, inspirational but very short executive order into meaningful changes, dealing, against the backdrop of varying statutes. But I think, the idea you're raising, Amy, of just like good enough cost benefit is one thing, and sort of getting away from, since the precision is a fraud anyway, just sort of build that in. Of course, it's a fraud, and actually one other thing that's in the Stop Corporate Capture Act implicitly also is it's not just a fraud on the benefit side, it's a fraud on the cost side, and there's a lot of empirical evidence on that. And having that sort of put forward from OIRA, saying like, yeah, we should do our best to guess what the cost is, but we should recognize that our, to your information asymmetry point, we're heavily reliant on industry. They have an obvious self-interest in exaggerating costs. They have an historical record of exaggerating costs in ways that are often orders of magnitude higher than they turn out to be. Okay, in taking into account these other values, we shouldn't get too hung up on exactly this level of cost that they have, and having to beat it exactly, or some or some multiple. I just think there's a lot of things that we can kind of really dive into, and they're easier to do, and we can sort of do them on our own and abstractly do it, but they become very practical if we can react to something from the agent, from OIRA, including the idea that there's a cost to delay. The delay has its own, right? They want to do some, if they want, the time value of delayed rules, like that's actually a material dollar cost for humanity. Like there's a lot of stuff we could sort of start to play with, but we just need something to work off of.
Rob, that reminds me of the other thing I wanted to say about timing, and that was exactly it, is your idea of, there's been all these executive orders at various times that have told OIRA to do these look back studies, right, to try to see if the projections about costs and benefits that were made at the time that a rule was issued actually turned out to be legitimate in hindsight. But why not have OIRA, direct the agencies, or OIRA itself do some studies about the costs of delay, how many people died because it took this amount of time to get this rule out, and so on and so forth. There's at the Center for Progressive Reform, we did a white paper, actually, might be 10 years old at this point, and I think it was called The Costs of Delay. That is in a sense a blueprint of what I'm suggesting that OIRA might want to take on.
Yeah, I mean, we could go back to the heat stress rule that I mentioned at the top. I mean, the rule is going to be challenged and so on, but if the administration is able to stay in office, they're going to issue the rule. And it's going to say what I said. It's going to be water, shade, and rest. And just a matter of waiting 8 years for them to sort of work out the details on that. And there's an identifiable number of people who will suffer, some of whom will die as a result. Like in terms of your data point, there's new data now that the incidence of injury is like thousands of times more than officially being reported. So there's probably almost 200,000 people a year who are suffering severe illness from heat stress. And I don't exactly know how many of those will be averted by reasonable rules, but it's going to be a lot. And okay, if we're lucky and get it done in 8 years, 8 times that number, that's a lot of needless suffering. And it's not my thing to monetize that, but one could. And it's a lot of money.
Or even just, you don't have to monetize it. You can say this many people die,
Correct.
right? We know what that means. Yeah.
I agree with you guys are saying, and I do want to throw in one note of caution, which you sounded, Robert. So I'd be curious to know what your reaction is to it, which is that there are bad regulations that bring us in the opposite direction that will predictably happen the next time we have a president who does not share our particular environmental or public health or consumer protection values. And when designing a regulatory process, we need to be as cognizant of the need to have meaningful public input and transparency into bad rules as we do making sure that good rules can move forward without being hamstrung by, all of the issues we've been talking today. So what are your thoughts on how we balance that?
It's a great point. I mean, over at Public Citizen, our litigators who focus mostly on challenging the bad rules and less on pushing the good rules, they say that all the time. Just like, chill out, like we need those standards. So I think it's a balance. I do think that some of the, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think one is that I think the approach of the Stop Corporate Capture Act, because it's distinguishing between corporations and people, it's sort of, you kind of skirt the problem for the most part. And I do think, notwithstanding what we're brainstorming about here and ways to make it a little loosey-goosey, which I think the court's only going to permit so much of that anyway. But including the values, the non-quantifiable values, and but building that out in ways that's meaningful from the executive order. I think those things too, by and large, are going to just cut in favor of being more protective, not less. So I do think there are things that we can do that are sort of, I think make the regulatory system work better from the point of view we have, which is I think non-ideological, just based on the purpose of the agencies and the idea of protecting human beings and the planet. So it is, but not, without, so you're completely right, and we should not, we'll be sorry if we don't pay attention to that challenge. But at the same time, I think we can do a set of things that will take us in the right direction and take that into account.
Well, I am loving this back and forth between the panelists. It's fantastic. And we're servicing so many great ideas. I think on that last point of, being aware of the threats of bad regulation takes us all the way back to Rachel's comments on bad legislation that could move to try to weaken the regulatory process as well. I think a big part of CSS is thinking about, how do we hold both ideas in our heads at the same time, pushing for the progressive, important changes we need so we can get good public protections through while also defending against the worst ideas that would make it harder to do that. So I don't think we have any additional questions from folks in the audience. And so to wrap us up, just give everyone a chance to do a quick 30-second last thoughts, I think framed a little bit around, what can folks who are attending today or in the community do to support or engage intellectually or help as we have this opportunity moment at OIRA before and after the focal point of the information actually coming out of OIRA about the EO. So with that, I will go to Rob first, as you are off mute.
The price I get for being off mute. Well, I've said it. I mean, I think we have this. It's an unparalleled opportunity with people who actually have a progressive and public interest-minded orientation inside OIRA, and we just have to help them do what they want to do, which means both, talking to them directly, but talking to people around them who they need support from to get the job done.
Great. Rachel?
Well, I agree with that, but I also think figuring out ways to have these conversations to help us argue in the best possible ways to OIRA, to other policymakers, how to improve this process, and thinking creatively how to get around obstacles, whether it's regulatory or legal or legislative interpretation. I think having these conversations, and shameless plug for CSS to participate in our weekly lobby calls where we talk about a lot of these ideas and concrete issues that we're dealing with day to day, but I think they will help enable us to be even more effective as we're pushing for these necessary.
Fantastic. Professor Sinden?
Oh boy, I mean, I guess I would just say, don't give up and remember the long game. You think about some of the ideas on the right that the right wing, sort of banged their drum about for decade upon decade, and then, have over the past several decades sort of come to dominate our public policy discussion. Cost benefit analysis is one of them, but there's many. We have to bang that drum, even louder from our side. And I think continuing to find ways to show how the regulatory process, draw those direct lines from the regulatory process to people's lives and what it actually means.
Fantastic. And Andrew.
Well, maybe just to go back to the opening remarks, is that I don't think there's a sufficient feeling of urgency from the administration right now on the regulatory side. I suspect some of that is because there's been so much focus on the Build Back Better Act and a legislative focus and a desire not to distract from that. But all of us who are listening to this call, or our panelists, need to convey to the various agencies that we interact with, not just OIRA, whether it's the EPA or a Consumer Protection Bureau, that they need to get moving. That the clock is ticking, that they're going to run out of time. And that a huge part of the president's agenda is going to rise or fall on the success of its regulatory agenda.
Well said. Well, I want to thank everyone on behalf of the 160 organizations in the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards for being with us today. Huge thanks, of course, to Sam Berger for joining us at the top, and Representative Jayapal, and to all of our panelists. This was a fantastic discussion. Really appreciate everyone being with us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks all.